On a drizzly March morning in the rolling hills of Gloucestershire, Harold Bramblewood stood in the grand foyer of Thornwick Manor, adjusting his silk tie while reviewing the week's agenda with the same meticulous attention he'd applied to building his $40 million empire. At 62, the self-made shipping magnate took particular pleasure in reminding everyone around him, especially his staff, of the vast gulf between his success and their humble circumstances. The object of his current amusement was Arthur Fieldstone, his head groundskeeper for the past 18 years. Arthur, a soft-spoken man of 58 with calloused hands and dirt under his fingernails, had just finished his weekly report on the manor's extensive grounds when Harold decided to indulge in what he considered harmless entertainment at his employees' expense. "Arthur, my good man," Harold said with the patronizing tone he reserved for those he considered beneath his station, "I understand your cottage is rather cramped for your growing family. Your daughter Sarah's new baby must be making things quite tight in that little two-bedroom place I so generously provide." Arthur shifted uncomfortably, knowing that any response would somehow be turned against him. "We manage fine, sir. Sarah's grateful for the roof over her head while she gets back on her feet." Harold's smile carried the cold satisfaction of a man about to deliver what he considered a magnificent jest. "Well, I've been thinking about your situation, and I believe I have the perfect solution. You know that bull of mine, the one the livestock agent called completely worthless for breeding purposes? The one that cost me $15,000 and turned out to be nothing but an expensive lawn ornament? The bull in question, a massive Hereford named Wellington, had been the subject of considerable embarrassment for Harold. Purchased at great expense from a prestigious breeder, Wellington had proven to be what the agricultural experts termed genetically inferior, unable to sire offspring, and apparently lacking the aggressive temperament that made bulls valuable for breeding programs. "Yes, sir, I know the one," Arthur replied, wondering where this conversation was leading. "I'm giving him to you," Harold announced with theatrical generosity, his voice loud enough to ensure that Mrs. Pennywhistle, the housekeeper, and James Copperton, the butler, could hear every word. "Consider it a bonus for your years of faithful service. I'm sure a man of your background will appreciate the gift." The cruelty of the gesture wasn't lost on anyone present. Harold was effectively giving Arthur an animal that would cost a fortune to feed and house, provide no economic benefit, and serve as a daily reminder of his employer's wealth and power. It was charity disguised as mockery, a gift designed to humiliate rather than help. Arthur's face flushed with embarrassment, but his voice remained steady. "That's very generous, sir, but I don't have proper facilities for a bull. Perhaps—" "Nonsense," Harold interrupted, clearly enjoying himself. "I'll have the lads from the estate delivery service drop him off at your cottage this afternoon. I'm sure you'll find a way to manage. After all, resourcefulness is supposed to be a virtue among the working classes, isn't it?" Mrs. Pennywhistle, who'd known Arthur since he started working at Thornwick Manor, caught his eye with a look of sympathetic outrage. She'd watched Harold's casual cruelties toward his staff for years, but this seemed particularly calculated to cause maximum embarrassment and financial hardship. That afternoon, as promised, Wellington arrived at Arthur's modest cottage in a livestock trailer, accompanied by two estate workers who could barely contain their amusement at the absurdity of delivering a massive bull to a property barely large enough for a vegetable garden. Arthur's wife, Margaret, came out to see what the commotion was about, her face a mixture of confusion and growing anger as she realized what her husband's employer had done. "Harold Bramblewood gave you a bull?" she asked, her voice rising with each word. "Arthur, that man has lost his bloody mind. How are we supposed to feed and house a creature that size? And what's Sarah going to think when she comes home to find a bull in our back garden?" Arthur watched Wellington being unloaded into the hastily constructed temporary pen the estate workers had thrown together. Despite the humiliating circumstances of his arrival, the bull was undeniably magnificent, easily 1,800 pounds of muscle and bone, with the kind of noble bearing that spoke of excellent bloodlines despite his supposed genetic deficiencies. "There's something not right about this," Arthur said quietly, studying Wellington's movements and behavior. "Harold may be cruel, but he's not stupid. He doesn't throw away 15,000 pounds just to make a point, and he certainly doesn't give away valuable animals as jokes." Margaret joined him at the fence, watching as Wellington surveyed his new surroundings with calm intelligence. "You think there's more to this than just Harold being his usual horrible self?" I think Harold Bramblewood doesn't do anything without calculating the benefit to himself first. If he's giving us this bull, it's because he expects to profit from our struggle to manage him somehow. That evening, as Arthur walked around the makeshift pen checking on Wellington's comfort, he noticed something that the expensive livestock experts had apparently missed. The bull's movements were measured and deliberate. His responses to human presence showed remarkable intelligence, and most significantly, his interaction with the cottage's surroundings suggested an animal with far more awareness than any genetically inferior creature should possess. "What exactly are you, Wellington?" Arthur murmured, watching the bull position himself where he could observe both the cottage and the surrounding countryside. "And why did Harold Bramblewood really want to get rid of you?" As the evening mist settled over the Gloucestershire hills, Arthur Fieldstone began to suspect that his employer's cruel jest might have backfired in ways that Harold could never have anticipated. The rejected bull was about to reveal secrets that would turn a calculated humiliation into the most expensive mistake of Harold Bramblewood's privileged life. If this story of arrogance meeting its match already has you rooting for the underdog, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that prove sometimes the best revenge is simply letting cruel people destroy themselves. The first sign that Wellington was far from ordinary came 3 days after his arrival, when Arthur discovered the bull had somehow reorganized the cottage's small paddock into distinct areas for grazing, resting, and what could only be described as observation. No ordinary bull possessed the intelligence to create such purposeful environmental management, and certainly not one that agricultural experts had deemed genetically inferior. Margaret noticed it first during her morning tea, watching through the kitchen window, as Wellington methodically moved around his enclosure with the precision of an animal conducting a systematic survey. "Arthur, you need to see this. That bull isn't just wandering about, he's studying everything." Arthur joined his wife at the window, and what he observed made him question everything the expensive livestock experts had told Harold about Wellington's supposed deficiencies. The bull was indeed studying his surroundings, but more than that, he was demonstrating problem-solving abilities that suggested exceptional intelligence rather than genetic inferiority. "Margaret, I think we need to have Wellington properly evaluated, not by Harold's expensive consultants, but by someone who might actually know what they're looking at." The person Arthur had in mind was Dr. Elizabeth Moorhaven, a respected veterinarian who operated a practice in the nearby village of Little Thornwick. Unlike the high-priced specialists Harold typically employed, Dr. Moorhaven had built her reputation on practical experience with working animals rather than theoretical knowledge of expensive bloodlines. Dr. Moorhaven arrived that afternoon in her battered Land Rover, her weathered face showing the kind of skepticism that came from 40 years of dealing with both animals and the people who claimed to understand them. At 64, she'd seen enough genuine expertise masquerading as ignorance and enough ignorance disguised as expertise to trust her own judgment over anyone's reputation. "So Harold Bramblewood's cast-off bull is causing a stir in the village," she said, approaching Wellington's pen with the careful respect that experienced veterinarians showed all large animals. "Word is he gave you this animal as some sort of cruel joke." "That was certainly his intention," Arthur replied, watching as Dr. Moorhaven began her examination. "But I'm beginning to think the joke might be on Harold." What Dr. Moorhaven discovered during her comprehensive evaluation would have shocked Harold's expensive consultants if they'd had the competence to recognize it. Wellington's physical condition was exceptional, his bloodline markers suggested superior genetics, and most remarkably, his behavioral patterns indicated intelligence levels that placed him among the most cognitively advanced animals she'd ever encountered. "Arthur, where exactly did Harold acquire this bull?" "Doctor," Moorhaven asked, reviewing her findings with growing amazement. "Paid $15,000 for him at some exclusive auction. Said the breeding experts told him Wellington was worthless for reproduction and had inferior genetics." Dr. Moorhaven's expression shifted from professional interest to barely controlled outrage. "Those experts either committed malpractice or deliberately misrepresented this animal's value. Wellington isn't just breeding quality, he's extraordinary. His genetic markers suggest he could sire offspring worth hundreds of thousands of pounds." "Then why would they tell Harold he was worthless?" "That's what we need to find out. But Arthur, if I'm right about this bull's true value, Harold Bramblewood may have just given you the most expensive gift in Gloucestershire. That evening brought an unexpected visitor in the form of James Copperton, Harold's butler, who arrived at the cottage with the furtive manner of someone conducting business he didn't want his employer to discover. James had served the Bramblewood family for 35 years, long enough to recognize when his employer's arrogance had led him into dangerous territory. "Arthur, I've come to warn you about something," James said, glancing around nervously to ensure they weren't being observed. "Harold's been making phone calls about Wellington. He's contacted several livestock dealers, asking questions about the bull's background and current value." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest he's having second thoughts about giving Wellington away. I overheard him talking to his solicitor about whether gifts to employees could be revoked under certain circumstances." Margaret's face flushed with anger. "That bastard gives us a bull as a cruel joke, and now he wants to take it back because he thinks it might be worth something?" "There's more," James continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Harold's been asking questions about Arthur's financial situation, your cottage lease, and whether the estate has any legal claim to improvements made to employee housing." Arthur felt a cold realization settling over him. Harold wasn't just having second thoughts about Wellington. He was positioning himself to reclaim the bull while simultaneously threatening Arthur's housing and employment. It was exactly the kind of calculated cruelty that Harold specialized in, using his wealth and power to ensure that even his acts of apparent generosity served his interests. "James, what exactly did Harold's solicitor tell him?" "That employment contracts can be terminated for various reasons, and that gifts given in the context of employment relationships might be subject to different legal standards than personal gifts." That night, as Arthur walked around Wellington's pen in the gathering darkness, he realized that Dr. Moorhaven's discovery had placed his family in a precarious position. If Wellington was truly as valuable as the veterinarian believed, Harold would undoubtedly find a way to reclaim him, while punishing Arthur for having briefly possessed something of genuine worth. "You're not just a bull, are you, Wellington?" Arthur said quietly, watching as the animal moved closer to the fence with the same intelligent awareness that had characterized all his behavior. "You're a test of whether decent people can ever get ahead when cruel people hold all the power." Wellington's response was a soft rumble that might have been acknowledgement, and Arthur made a decision that would define the rest of his life. If Harold Bramblewood wanted to play games with other people's livelihoods, then perhaps it was time someone taught him that cruelty could be a double-edged sword. The rejected bull was about to become the catalyst for a confrontation that would reveal truths about wealth, power, and justice that neither Harold nor Arthur could have anticipated. But first, Arthur needed to discover exactly why Harold's expensive experts had so dramatically misrepresented Wellington's true value, and what his employer had been trying to hide behind the facade of a cruel joke. Dr. Elizabeth Moorhaven's return visit the following week brought documentation that would shatter Harold Bramblewood's carefully constructed narrative about Wellington's supposed worthlessness. Her independent research into the bull's bloodline had uncovered a conspiracy of expert manipulation that reached into the highest levels of Britain's agricultural establishment. "Arthur, I've spent the past week investigating Wellington's breeding records, and what I've discovered is extraordinary," Dr. Moorhaven said, spreading official documents across Arthur's kitchen table, while Margaret poured tea with hands that trembled slightly from anticipation. "This bull isn't just valuable, he's irreplaceable." The documents revealed that Wellington was the last living descendant of Monarch's Pride, a legendary Hereford bull whose genetics had produced some of the most valuable cattle in British agricultural history. Monarch's Pride's bloodline had been thought extinct for over a decade, making Wellington potentially worth millions rather than the 15,000 Harold had paid. "But how could the experts have missed something this significant?" Arthur asked, studying genetic charts that meant little to him but clearly excited Dr. Moorhaven. "They didn't miss it, Arthur. They deliberately concealed it. I've traced the evaluation reports from Harold's purchase, and every expert involved in Wellington's assessment had financial connections to Pemberton Agricultural Consortium, the same company that's been attempting to corner the market on premium Hereford genetics." Margaret set down her teacup with enough force to rattle the saucer. "You're saying they lied about Wellington's value so Harold would buy him cheap and then—" "What?" "So Harold would eventually sell him to Pemberton at a loss, not knowing what he really had. It's genetic theft disguised as expert consultation, and Harold was intended to be their unwitting accomplice. The implications were staggering. Harold hadn't just been deceived about Wellington's value, he'd been positioned as the fall guy in an elaborate fraud designed to steal irreplaceable genetic material from Britain's agricultural heritage. His arrogance and reliance on expensive experts had made him the perfect target for sophisticated criminals. But Dr. Moorhaven's most shocking revelation was yet to come. Arthur, I believe Harold discovered the truth about Wellington's value shortly after purchasing him. The timeline suggests he learned about the deception just before giving the bull to you. You mean he knew Wellington was worth millions when he gave him to me as a joke? I think Harold realized he'd been made a fool of by experts he'd trusted, and rather than admit he'd been duped, he decided to cut his losses by getting rid of Wellington in a way that satisfied his ego while avoiding further embarrassment. The cruelty of Harold's decision became clear as Arthur processed this information. Rather than exposing the fraud or seeking justice, Harold had chosen to dispose of Wellington through a calculated act of humiliation that would make Arthur bear the cost of maintaining an invaluable animal, while Harold preserved his reputation for business acumen. That afternoon brought confirmation of Dr. Moorhaven's theory in the form of Reginald Thornsbury, Harold's estate manager, who arrived at the cottage with barely concealed nervousness and a folder full of official-looking documents. Arthur, Mr. Bramblewood has asked me to discuss some changes to your employment arrangement, Reginald said, his usual confidence replaced by obvious discomfort with the message he'd been sent to deliver. What kind of changes? Well, there's been some concern about unauthorized livestock on estate property and questions about whether your cottage lease permits keeping large animals without proper insurance and veterinary oversight. Arthur recognized the setup immediately. Harold was creating pretext to reclaim Wellington while simultaneously threatening Arthur's job and housing. It was extortion disguised as estate management, designed to force Arthur to surrender the bull voluntarily rather than face unemployment and homelessness. Reginald, you've known me for 18 years. Do you really think I'd do anything to jeopardize my family's security over a bull? Reginald's face flushed with embarrassment. Arthur, I'm just delivering the message. But between you and me, there's something not right about this whole business. Harold's been meeting with lawyers and livestock dealers, asking questions about bull retrievals and gift reversals. That evening, Arthur made a decision that would test everything he believed about justice, loyalty, and the courage required to stand up to powerful people who assumed their wealth made them untouchable. He called Dr. Moorhaven and asked her to document everything she'd discovered about Wellington's true value and the conspiracy that had surrounded his sale. If Harold wants to play games with my family's livelihood, Arthur told Margaret as they watched Wellington graze peacefully in his pen, then perhaps it's time he learned that some gifts can't be taken back, especially when they're given by people who don't understand what they're giving away. Margaret joined him at the fence, studying the bull who'd become the center of a confrontation that would determine their family's future. Arthur, if we fight Harold over this, we could lose everything, our home, your job, our security. And if we don't fight him, we'll lose our dignity, and our daughter will learn that decent people always have to bow to cruel ones. Sometimes, Margaret, the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing. The next morning brought news that would escalate their confrontation with Harold into something far more significant than a dispute over a single bull. Dr. Moorhaven had contacted agricultural authorities about the fraud involving Wellington's evaluation, and her findings had triggered an investigation into Pemberton Agricultural Consortium's business practices. Arthur, Dr. T. Moorhaven said during her urgent phone call, Wellington isn't just valuable. He's evidence of systematic fraud that could bring down one of Britain's largest agricultural companies. If my suspicions are correct, Harold was targeted because his arrogance made him the perfect victim for their scheme. As Arthur absorbed this information, he realized that Wellington's arrival at his cottage had been more than Harold's cruel jest. It had been the beginning of a revelation that would expose corruption, challenge power, and test whether ordinary people could prevail against extraordinary wealth and influence. The rejected bull was about to become the catalyst for the most important fight of Arthur Fieldstone's life. A battle that would determine not just his family's future, but the integrity of Britain's agricultural establishment itself. The confrontation that would define everything came on a rain-soaked Thursday morning when Harold Bramblewood arrived at Arthur's cottage with his solicitor, 2 estate workers, and a livestock trailer bearing the Thornwick Manor crest. Harold's face carried the cold satisfaction of a man about to demonstrate the ultimate futility of challenging superior wealth and social position. "Arthur, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about Wellington," Harold announced, his voice carrying across the small garden with theatrical authority. "My solicitor has informed me that gifts given within employment relationships can be revoked under certain circumstances, particularly when proper care cannot be provided." Arthur stepped out of his cottage with Margaret beside him, both of them having prepared for this moment since Dr. Moorhaven's revelations about Wellington's true value and the conspiracy surrounding his purchase. Behind them, Sarah emerged with her infant daughter, her face showing the fear of someone whose security was about to be destroyed by forces beyond her control. "What circumstances would those be, Harold?" Arthur asked, his voice carrying a calmness that seemed to surprise his employer. "Well, you clearly lack proper facilities for a bull of Wellington's requirements. The estate cannot be held liable for any accidents or inadequate care that might diminish his value." The irony of Harold's concern for Wellington's value wasn't lost on anyone present, particularly Dr. Moorhaven, who chose that moment to arrive in her Land Rover with a folder full of documents that would change the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "Mr. Bramblewood," Dr. Moorhaven called out as she approached the group. "How fortunate to find you here. I've been hoping to discuss my recent findings about Wellington's bloodline with someone who might appreciate their significance." Harold's confidence flickered slightly as he recognized the veterinarian whose reputation for competence and integrity stood in stark contrast to the expensive experts he typically employed. "Dr. Moorhaven, this is really a private matter between myself and my employee." "Actually, I think it's become a matter of considerable public interest," Dr. Moorhaven replied, opening her folder to reveal documentation that made Harold's solicitor step forward with obvious concern. "You see, I've discovered that Wellington is the last living descendant of Monarch's pride, making him potentially worth several £1,000,000 rather than the 15,000 you paid." The color drained from Harold's face as he processed the implications of Dr. Moorhaven's revelation. If Wellington was truly worth millions, then his decision to give the bull away as a cruel jest had just cost him more money than most people earned in a lifetime. "That's impossible," Harold stammered, his composure cracking for the first time in Arthur's memory. "The experts assured me Wellington was genetically inferior, unsuitable for breeding, completely worthless. Those experts were either criminally incompetent or deliberately deceptive," Dr. Moorhaven continued, producing additional documents that made Harold's solicitor whisper urgently in his client's ear. "I've traced their connections to Pemberton Agricultural Consortium, and it appears you were targeted for an elaborate fraud designed to steal irreplaceable genetic material." Arthur watched as Harold's arrogance transformed into something approaching panic. The man who'd spent 18 years treating his employees as sources of amusement was discovering that his cruel jest had backfired in the most expensive way possible. "Furthermore," Dr. Moorhaven added, addressing Harold's solicitor directly, "I've been in contact with agricultural fraud investigators who are very interested in the expert evaluations that led to Wellington's misrepresentation. They'll want to interview Mr. E.C. Bramblewood about his role in what appears to be a sophisticated genetic theft operation." Harold's solicitor, recognizing the legal minefield his client had stumbled into, began damage control immediately. "Dr. Moorhaven, surely we can resolve this matter privately. If there's been some misunderstanding about the bull's value—" "The only misunderstanding," Arthur interrupted, speaking for the first time since Harold's arrival, "was yours about what kind of man you were dealing with when you decided to humiliate my family for your entertainment." The power dynamic that had defined Harold and Arthur's relationship for 18 years shifted irrevocably in that moment. Harold, who'd always held absolute authority over his employees' livelihood, suddenly found himself facing a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from exposing the truth. "Arthur, surely we can discuss this reasonably," Harold said, his voice carrying a note of desperation that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier. "If Wellington is indeed valuable, perhaps we can arrange some sort of partnership." "The same kind of partnership you offered when you gave him to me as a joke?" Margaret interjected, her voice sharp with years of suppressed anger at Harold's treatment of her family. "When you expected us to bankrupt ourselves feeding and housing an animal you thought was worthless? That afternoon brought the arrival of Inspector Charlotte Whitmore from the Agricultural Fraud Investigation Unit, whose preliminary inquiry into Pemberton Agricultural Consortium had led her directly to Harold's purchase of Wellington. Her investigation would reveal the full scope of the conspiracy that had targeted Harold's arrogance and turned his wealth against him. "Mr. Bramblewood, we have evidence that you were specifically chosen as a target for this fraud because of your reputation for ostentatious spending and reliance on expensive consultants," Inspector Whitmore explained during her interview. "The perpetrators counted on your ego, preventing you from seeking independent evaluation of their assessments." Harold's humiliation was complete when Inspector Whitmore revealed that his name had appeared on Pemberton's target list alongside other wealthy individuals whose arrogance made them ideal victims for sophisticated agricultural fraud. His reputation for treating employees with casual cruelty had actually made him a preferred mark for criminals who understood that proud men rarely admitted when they'd been deceived. "The irony, Mr. Bramblewood," Inspector Whitmore concluded, "is that your decision to give Wellington away probably saved you from becoming an unwitting accomplice to genetic theft. If you'd kept the bull and sold him to Pemberton as they'd planned, you could have faced serious criminal charges." As the investigators departed and Harold retreated to Thornwick Manor with his reputation in ruins and his fortune diminished by his own arrogance, Arthur stood beside Wellington's pen, reflecting on the extraordinary reversal of fortune that had transformed a cruel jest into poetic justice. The rejected bull had indeed changed everything, not just Arthur's financial circumstances, but the entire balance of power in their small corner of Gloucestershire, where a wealthy man's cruelty had finally met its match in the quiet dignity of someone who'd refused to be humiliated without fighting back. 6 months after Harold Bramblewood's humiliating retreat from Arthur's cottage, the transformation of the Fieldstone family's circumstances had become the talk of Little Thornwick Village. Arthur now owned Wellington outright through a legal settlement that had cost Harold nearly $2 million in compensation for his attempted theft of the bull, while additional damages from the fraud investigation had forced Harold to sell portions of his estate to cover mounting legal costs. The cottage that had once symbolized Arthur's subservient position now served as headquarters for Fieldstone Genetics, a thriving breeding operation built around Wellington's extraordinary bloodline. Arthur's 18 years of practical experience with livestock, dismissed by Harold as mere manual labor, had proven invaluable in developing breeding programs that attracted clients from across Britain and Europe. "It's remarkable how quickly fortune can change when people finally see your true worth," Dr. Elizabeth Moorhaven observed, watching Wellington interact with his offspring in the expanded pastures that now surrounded the cottage. "6 months ago, Harold thought he was giving you a burden. Now Wellington's genetics are generating more income than Harold's entire shipping business." Margaret emerged from the cottage-turned office carrying financial reports that still amazed her family every month. Wellington's breeding fees alone were generating $50,000 monthly, while his offspring commanded premium prices that had established the Fieldstone name among Britain's most respected agricultural operations. "Sarah's university fees are fully covered, the cottage mortgage is paid off, and we've got enough saved to expand the operation again next spring," Margaret announced, her voice carrying disbelief at their transformed circumstances. "Arthur, do you ever think about how different things might have been if Harold hadn't been such a cruel man?" Arthur scratched behind Wellington's ears, a gesture that had become their daily ritual since those first difficult days, when the bull's arrival had seemed like Harold's final insult. "Actually, Margaret, I think Harold's cruelty was exactly what needed to happen. If he'd been decent, we'd never have discovered Wellington's true value, and Harold would probably still be exploiting both of us. The most satisfying aspect of their success wasn't financial. It was watching Harold grapple with the consequences of his systematic underestimation of people he'd considered beneath his notice. The Pemberton Agricultural Consortium fraud investigation had revealed that Harold's arrogance had made him the perfect target for sophisticated criminals who'd counted on his contempt for inferior people, preventing him from recognizing superior expertise when he encountered it. Inspector Charlotte Whitmore's final report had documented how Harold's reliance on expensive consultants over practical knowledge had cost him millions in fraudulent deals beyond just Wellington's misrepresentation. His assumption that wealth equated to competence had made him vulnerable to every confidence scheme that targeted wealthy individuals with more money than sense. Harold's problem Arthur told the BBC reporter who'd come to document their story for a program about agricultural fraud. Wasn't that he was generous with his cruelty? It was that he never understood the difference between having money and having judgment. The reporter's story would air nationally, ensuring that Harold's humiliation extended far beyond Gloucestershire's agricultural community. The segment portrayed Arthur as a hard-working man whose quiet competence had triumphed over inherited wealth and casual arrogance, while Harold appeared as a cautionary tale about the dangers of treating people as sources of entertainment. But perhaps the most poetic justice came when Harold was forced to apply for employment with several agricultural operations that had previously courted his investment. His reputation for poor judgment and fraud association had destroyed his credibility in business circles, leaving him with practical skills far inferior to the man he'd spent 18 years treating as a servant. Dr. Moorhaven brought news of Harold's latest humiliation during one of her monthly visits to evaluate Wellington's health and breeding progress. Harold applied for a consulting position with Morrison Agricultural Services last week. They turned him down after discovering he'd been duped by fraudsters and had given away Britain's most valuable bull as a practical joke. "What's he doing now?" Margaret asked, though her tone suggested more curiosity than sympathy. "Working as a junior estate manager for the Pembridge family in Surrey. The irony is that he's now doing essentially the same work Arthur did for him, but for a fraction of the salary and with none of the respect Arthur earned through competence." That evening, as Arthur walked through pastures that now hosted some of Britain's most valuable cattle, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with Harold's cruel jest and ended with complete reversal of their social positions. Wellington grazed peacefully among his offspring, his genetics ensuring that the Fieldstone name would be associated with agricultural excellence for generations to come. "You know what the real lesson is, Wellington?" Arthur said, offering the bull his evening treat of fresh hay. "Harold thought he was teaching me about my place in the world, but what he actually taught me was that cruel people always underestimate everyone around them, and that underestimation becomes their greatest weakness." Wellington's contented rumble seemed to agree, as the two unlikely partners, the rejected bull and the dismissed employee, surveyed the empire they'd built from Harold Bramblewood's arrogance and the timeless truth that genuine worth always reveals itself when given the opportunity. The millionaire who'd thought he was delivering a crushing humiliation had instead delivered the foundation for his own downfall, proving that sometimes the cruelest jokes are the ones that backfire on those who tell them. In this story of pride, prejudice, and poetic justice, a wealthy man's casual cruelty transforms into his greatest defeat, while the targets of his arrogance discover that true worth cannot be diminished by those too blind to recognize it. A millionaire gave his poor employee a rejected bull as a joke, but ended up bitterly regretting it.